He's John Timpane.
And he's Don Rooney.
And this is
The Musical Innertube.
Now, you may ask, why is this podcast called The Musical Innertube?
And we may reply, because that's its name, of course.
Now, how did this podcast get that name?
Back in college, we hosted a radio show. Once, we tried to introduce a soothing musical interlude.
Instead, we messed up and wound up introducing a soothing musical innertube, and the name stuck.
So here we are, hundreds of years later, still talking
to interesting people about their interesting lives.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
Now, you may or may not know it, but permafrost covers a fifth of the northern hemisphere, under the Arctic tundra of Alaska, Canada, and Russia. It serves as kind of a time capsule. It preserves the mummified remains of a number of extinct animals that scientists have been able to unearth and study in recent years, including a couple of cave lion cubs and a woolly rhino, because global warming is causing the permafrost to melt. Now, recently, scientists revived a worm that was frozen 46,000 years ago. That all sounds fun, but here's the scary part. An anthrax outbreak in Siberia that affected dozens of humans and more than 2,000 reindeer between July and August of 2016 has been linked to the thawing of the permafrost because it allowed old spores of anthrax to resurface from old burial grounds and animal carcasses. So there you go. That's a problem. Here to talk with us about this thawing menace is Art Caplan. He's the Doctors William F. and Virginia Connolly Mitty Professor and founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. And Art, is it a zombie menace?
It is a zombie menace. Just think about what happens when you lose power in your refrigerator defrosts, and think about what's in there and what it turns into, and then multiply that by about 30,000 years of gunky, leftover, deceased crud. And you can see why you might be unleashing a real problem for all of humanity. I can tell you, you guys know NYU, some other places have been trying to use organs from pigs as substitutes for human organs for transplant. One thing that has us all very nervous is communicating viruses from these current animals into humans who are immunosuppressed, whose resistance is down so they can accept the organ, and then they turn into spreaders of all kinds of current weird pig viruses. Animals have all kinds of viruses that jump out and get us. We have a fight, as you know, about COVID, and did that start in a market from live animals? But it's certainly the case that avian flu and many, many other nasty things come out of animals. Well, these are at least viruses, hopefully, that we have some resistance to because they're around all the time. You defrost something from, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, we don't have resistance to that anymore because we haven't been exposed to it for a long time.
It certainly sounds horrific. I guess the question is there something that we could do about it? It doesn't look like global warming is going to cease tomorrow, no matter what we do. Do we just be readier than we are for this?
Well, I think you're right, John. We're not reversing global warming in time to refreeze the permafrost. And as Dawn pointed out, that permafrost covers a huge swath of the globe. It's all of Siberia, a good part of up in the Yukon and northern Canada. So there's lots of it, and most of it is starting to melt. I think it's hopeless to say that we're going to reverse this process. It's already underway, and I think it's going to take place over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I think what you've got to do is basically 3 things. One, you've got to start to restrict digging up old animals and just dragging them around for the local museum. That's not really a great idea. There are also companies out there that have it in mind to dig up some of these old creatures and maybe use their DNA to resurrect them.
De-extinction, right?
De-extinction.
Jurassic Park.
It sounds like a group that only us three will remember. It's Devo.
We are Devo. Devo.
But I do think that's got dangers, just, if you will, trying to extract the creatures. So we've got to get on top of what's getting dug up and where it goes. Second, I think people ought to be alert to the need for much more surveillance and testing. The world stinks at this. We don't have enough monitoring and surveillance of what's going on in different places to give us early warnings of the presence of new viruses, whether it's a Chinese market where they're killing rare species for food, or because they think they have medicinal properties, or some, remote location in Siberia. But you want to be able to test. And I think that's really important. And third, we could use a little international regulation here. What's the penalty if you don't do this stuff? Well, right now, maybe you die because you dug up something and it killed you, but there's no laws, there's no treaties, there's no nothing. In fact, shipping around exotic species now is something of a pretty big business. So we could use tighter controls over what's going where with real penalties.
I've seen stories recently where people have complained that they can't take their dogs into a country because they have to be quarantined, or their cats, household pets. And yet the exotic animal trade is running below the radar. You can get boa constrictors and anteaters and all sorts of very weird and exotic animals in, because those arrive at the ports and are in boxes and are just shipped in without anybody looking at them when they come in.
Yeah. And I think that really is a real source of danger. Even a terrorist could just say, well, I think I'll dig up some little creature. Looks like it has some anthrax. I'll throw that in a box and send it somewhere to attack my enemies. It's a different type of biological warfare. I don't understand, by the way, what is going on at these ports with these containers. I know we got zillions of containers, but it does seem to me, what do we sample? Like 1/100th of 1% of them to see if they've got people in them or drugs in them or weird species in them. That's got to be much toughened up. We don't take that policy at airports. You go through there, people are, opening up suitcases and looking at you to see. I don't know why we treat the ports like, it's a free fire zone.
Partly it's that you want free trade. You want as much as possible to feel that trade can go easily across borders. On the other hand, what you say is true. That's a risk. It's a risk in people. It's a risk in services. It's a risk in goods. Goods, as we know, the United States is a great example. A lot of goods have come here and had a great time growing all over the place. Kazoo, and I'm surprised to hear that there isn't a protocol, some kind of epidemiologic protocol when you're digging up, say, mammoth or dire wolf remains. As far as you know, there's no international standard of best practices with this?
No, there's nothing. There really is nothing governing this whole thing. A little bit akin to people who go out and look for dinosaur bones. Now, they are usually in warm climates and completely dried out. They're not carrying much of a risk. And normally, you basically have people collecting them as souvenirs, sometimes for museums. But again, you can go out and do that. The issue is, whose land are you on? You have your permission to be there. That's about it. There's no real rules about who can do it and how qualified you have to be, or can you take some national treasure and hide it a little bit, stealing artwork from other countries and deciding to put it in your private collection. So that's it's a kind of a wild, wild west out there. They're amateurs. They're people just wandering out there saying, hey, I want to build in this new land that just defrosted. I guess I'll dig up all the junk that I don't want in the way and throw it over there and start to build something. And remember, in some parts of the world, this melting is being greeted with joy. Siberia is not a place the Russians can do anything with, but if it melts, eventually they might be able to grow crops or do something up there. And I know Canada's always dreamed of opening up a passageway from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So these are also places where you could get a lot more human exposure, is what I mean, than you ever had. No one's there now to get sick. Even if something defrosted, nothing would happen. But if you build villages or farms or you got boats sailing through, then you got a lot more risk.
Now, when we talk about international cooperation among medical and political people, we didn't have a whole lot. We've talked about this a lot on past shows. We didn't have a lot of cooperation here within the United States amongst federal officials and local health officials. In fact, there was a lot of counties that got hit hard by COVID that didn't even have any kind of health officials in them. So how realistic is it to think that we can put something together in a relatively short amount of time that would cope with this problem?
Not very. So our friends in Russia these days aren't exactly inclined to be cooperative with us or with Western countries, they say, as supporting their enemies in the Ukraine. I'm sure North Korea wakes up every day trying to figure out how they can work with us better to collaborate on public health. And, there are certainly even nations that are supposed to be collaborating. They don't always trust each other. They don't always want to share information. Some of it has to do with trade secrets or their economic plans and this sort of stuff. I think given that reality that some cooperation might happen, but not total, the other thing we've got to do is build up the health system so that it can identify a new form of anthrax.
Oh, yeah.
Old form of anthrax, and have, vaccinations ready or medicines ready, things that we thought were gone. Smallpox is one that that keeps me awake. Smallpox, highly contagious. We stopped vaccinating for it a long time ago because we eliminated it, but that doesn't mean it's not around. Remember that guy they dug up in the mountains in Austria, the Iceman?
Utsil. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what diseases he might have had, but it wouldn't shock me that he was exposed to smallpox and that he probably had some encounters with other bacterial infections that we just don't see anymore. So you need, again, we have a health system that basically responds to what it's getting attacked by. You'll remember how quick we were to have masks and protective gear. Not very. But it would be smart to start to build up some supplies and some warehouses and some reserves. And that's going to be the government, because it's not in the interest of any private company to do that. Build up something they may not ever use, not going to do that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think when you look at the good side of the equation about de-extinction, something like the frozen zoo in San Diego, and what I'm talking about is it's a sperm and egg bank for existing animals. And what this is, it's a very famous place. It's not the only kind like it.
Yeah, like that in Norway, I think.
There's a place like that in Norway, right? And in Norway, I think there's a lot more government money involved than there is in the frozen zoo. So when you have a sense that has to be done by, cowboy scientists who have a great idea, here you're talking about losing an ice cap, which is an international catastrophe. How are you going to persuade people? Well, we should also probably have these safeguards in place about the new critters that are being unleashed.
And remember, one of the places that's defrosting is the Antarctica. And people think of that as got no land, just giant ice, it'll melt and maybe flood us, but that's not true. It's a real continent. There were living things down there a long time ago, and we have no idea what kinds of creatures were meandering around under all that ice. So it isn't even clear who's got the international authority to do anything in Antarctica, right? Somebody sets up a base and says, well, within 100 miles a year, this is ours. And, it's not clear at all, just to really freak everybody out. Who's in charge of half of these places?
It sounds to me like someone's going to have a meeting with some other guys.
And there's another problem, too, that we have here in the U.S. as far as global warming is concerned, and that is that we're having cases of malaria pop up in Florida. Now, that's a tropical disease, but Florida and other southern states are becoming more and more tropical. 100-degree heat and humidity coming in all summer long. So, yeah, I mean, they're afraid that will not only lead to things like mosquitoes with malaria, but other diseases that are limited now to tropical areas will creep into more.
West Nile virus, dengue, it's a whole host of these creepy, crawly things that are insect-borne frequently, and as their range expands because of heat, that's trouble. All three of us live in parts of the United States where we're now stepping on lanternflies, which weren't here, but have definitely showed up to eat all of our foliage.
Yep.
Now let's put in a plug for something else. Everybody got totally, well, not everybody, but many people got totally freaked out by genetic modification of foods. So you go to a lot of restaurants that say absolutely no GMO or GMO free or certified with no GMO. I think that's a horrible mistake. Not so much that I'm telling you have to eat it, but if you want to fight off these bugs or you want to do battle with some of the fungi or different types of plant pests that attack bananas and coffee and citrus, you're going to have to genetically engineer some of these fruits and vegetables to withstand this stuff. It's our only answer. Otherwise, they'll just get wiped out.
That reminds me that there's a huge effort to re-engineer the elm tree, which is dying very, very rapidly in the Great Green Forest. And so I have a friend who works on this. And what they have done is they found a Japanese elm that they are trying to marry with North Carolina elm trees to grow up and resist the elm-killing bugs. And evidently they're having excellent success. They haven't started to plant them very much yet, but there are experimental gardens and elm tree farms. There's one up in northern Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact. And it seems to be great. So, and that's not GMO. That's sort of old school GMO, which is,
crossbreeding and
crossbreeding.
Traits you want, and then
splicing.
For that, splicing.
Yeah.
Before he says, well, that sounds unnatural. Remember, every drop of wine you drink is made that way. They're cloned from the same vines. Otherwise, they wouldn't taste the same every time you got a bottle of whatever it is, Chateauneuf de Pop from someplace. That's the same grapes. It's the Sangiovese grapes. If you're going to make them, you got to clone them. That means cross-breeding so that you're going to get the same outcomes. It's not like we don't have experience with heavily genetically engineered foods. I once had a challenge to my students to go into Whole Foods or some natural food store and find me something natural. Everything in there is a product of agriculture. There's maybe salt. I don't know. But even that has iodine in it, so it's probably no good. Doesn't count either. But they're not.
Every time you have a hamburger, it's coming from these animals. I mean, I keep telling people, next time you're in the woods, look for a cow. Look for a wild cow.
Or look for a wild tomato. I mean, you can eat it. It's like the size of a tiny cherry. And to breed those things. So, yeah, I mean, I think we have this because we're urban and civilized, or at least living in places where we get our food from markets mainly. We forget, none of this stuff grows in nature. There's no tangerines out there and all these apple versions we like. They don't exist in nature, and on it goes. So we've been modifying that world for a long time to modify it so that we can deal with the influx of invasive species, dangerous viruses, or climate change that is, going after plants that can't take so much rain or can't withstand drought. I'm telling you, I think that's the tool. And if we continue to act as if it's somehow, like nuclear radiation, I don't know that that's going to be allowed to help us.
We'll get back to the musical Innertube in just a moment, but first, let's pause for this soothing musical interlude.
Before Art Caplan was the William F. and Virginia Connolly Mitty Professor and founding head of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine in New York, he was the Caplan Professor of Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine in Philadelphia, where he created the Center for Bioethics and the Department of Medical Ethics.
Art is the author of 35 books and 800 papers in peer-reviewed journals. His books include Vaccination Ethics and Policy, The Ethics of Sport, Replacement Parts, The Ethics of Procuring and Replacing Organs in Humans, and The Case of Terry Schiavo, Ethics at the End of Life.
To learn more about Art, see his page on the NYU Medical Faculty website at med.nyu.edu/faculty/Arthur-L-Caplan.
Now, back to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
Speaking of nuclear radiation, I had a question in the back of my head. I saw Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer is basically the story of a physicist. He is a physicist who deals with the what if, the kind that come up with concepts. And the crux of the movie is that he and his fellow physicists have to take what they've been thinking about and make it a reality. Mm-hmm. Okay, what happens if we split the atom? How can we control it and make it into a bomb? They successfully do that. And of course, the minute the bomb's set off, he has reservations. Mm-hmm. He's completely against what he has created. And it took me back to John and I are baby boomers, as are you, growing up in post-war America, where everything was new and wonderful. We had plastics. We had DDT to kill all of the pests. We had combustion engines. We had refrigerators. We had fluorocarbons. Everything that made our lives better and easier. And it all came back to bite us on the ass. And every one of them creates cancer. So what it came to me as science is one of those things where you have to actually do it to see what happens. In other words, testing is what makes science reliable. And we were tested on, basically, for all those years. So is that one of the things that brings us back to this distrust of science that we had to fight off during COVID?
A little bit it is. I think a lot of people in science see science as all to the good. But if you looked at, pollution or plastic pollution or even the oil and gas industry, which is based on science, I mean, it's geological and chemical stuff and so on and on and on. A lot of people in the world see science as a pretty mixed bag. Some days helpful, nice to have doctors that can treat something, and other days not so helpful, bad to have atomic bombs and not know what to do with nuclear waste and on. So I do think that's a mixed bag that leads people to sort of maybe not have as much faith, if you will, in science when it says, will help you work through COVID, for example. Remember, a lot of people believe science brought us COVID, right? Some kind of biological weapon engineering in a lab somewhere. And I don't think that's true at all, because it makes for a crummy weapon. It's like you make a weapon that kills all your population. Everybody else is not a good weapon. But the mixed bag nature, I think, is there. You also mentioned something else, Don, which I think is neglected, and that is what makes science science is not, and this was a little distorted in Oppenheimer because you had all the theoretical physicists gathered, but they used a ton of engineers. They didn't get much credit. Somebody's got to build the darn bomb, and somebody's got to build the trigger, and somebody's got to do the power feeds to the labs and all that. That's the applied end of physics. We call it engineering, but we tend to make heroes out of the Einsteins and the Oppenheimers, the theoretical guys, because they sort of push the edge of, our speculations. But you don't build many bridges when you just have a collection of quantum physicists.
Since we're talking about mastodons and things like de-extinction, what are your views of the ethics of de-extinction? I ask this because I had to write about it at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I didn't think it was a good idea, mostly from the point of view of the animals that we would create, because it would probably expose them to infections that they couldn't fight off. And also probably they would be born with very serious birth defects, since we ain't that good at growing things just from DNA yet. Mm-hmm. So it was all from the point of view of the animals that we might create and their suffering. But in this discussion, we've been talking about the reverse of that, which is what happens to us because we're not careful. What do you think about de-extinction in general?
So I got a zinger, Don, to use on John. He said he had to write about it for the Inquirer, and I was thinking, he must have been writing about it for the newspaper business. De-extinction. But that's neither here nor there. I think when you recreate animals long dead, it is an ethical mess. Partly for the reason you said, they're going to be exposed, just like we worry about old bugs attacking us. I'd worry about new bugs attacking whatever it is we recreated. So it works both ways, and that's big trouble. Secondly, we don't have a lot of DNA, so in essence, what we're doing is cloning.
Right.
We clone animals now, but you don't hear much about it because most of them die. We're not very good at it. So it's not you'd figure by now we'd have at least a pork chop industry that came from cloned pigs, but the death rate in the clones is too high. Then, what are they going to eat? The environment that they were in 40, 50, 100,000 years ago is gone. So I don't know if they're going to eat today's plants or whatever it is. We'd have to recreate an environment in which they could sustain themselves. And that may be hard to do because we don't know exactly what it was. Then I think they're going to be pretty lonely. I mean, how many of these creatures are you going to make?
Right.
So they may be behaviorally weird and, looking for a mate or a friend or some other animal to run around with in a pack, but we only made one dinosaur or one, ancient mastodon, or maybe could afford two. And it's a problem that you see in zoos even now with small numbers of animals, and they're not really herded together and they don't live a group experience the way they were supposed to. So weirdly, I kind of oppose the whole thing. I mean, I think it's not just Jurassic Park and they're going to leave the island and come up and get us. I think we do a lot of harm to them and they'd suffer quite a bit. Combination of ignorance, half-assed skill in making these things. I know there are companies that want to do it, and every once in a while on social media, somebody interviews a scientist who says, I can't wait to recreate the dodo bird or whatever.
Well, I think that's happening now. I think some people, they say they have enough DNA since, there were a lot of stuffed dodos around. Yeah. So,
I'm sure you could get it, but even there, remember, DNA is nice, but then you need a mom, and the mom is more likely to be a chicken. And what dodo DNA does when it's given birth to by a chicken is not necessarily a dodo, because it's not all genes. There's developmental input that the mom has into the developing fetus. I'm sure you'd get something that was 98% dodo, but it's not really recreating. It's sort of similarities or something like that. So the whole movement I'm not really excited about.
So what do we think, bottom line on this? We need to get everybody together, and we need to get our heads straight and figure out rules and regulations for digging up the melting sod that's up in the tundra. But as I said before, with the politics involved, is that really going to happen? Plus, with rogue elements, talk about movies, that's a good movie, a rogue element,
Oh, yeah.
Some guy with billions of dollars who wants a mastodon for his own private zoo, takes his own personal helicopter up to the tundra and digs one up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of spokes on this wheel that we have to fix.
Yeah, I was going to write something soon about this, and I had a title which fits right into this. I haven't written it yet, but it's Little Louse on the Prairie. It's like, what bugs are going to be running around out there as the world melts around us, and we sort of redistribute where we are and where potential microbes are. I think the first step is just to recognize the problem. So it's got to go on our list of, 10 catastrophes to worry about. We got asteroids that might blow us to smithereens. We got these bugs that might come back and get us. The oceans are going to flood half of where we are. So we all got to, move inland 50 miles or something. And I know that's a lot to worry about if you also are trying to figure out how am I going to manage 2 jobs and 3 kids as a divorced mom. Worrying about bugs in the permafrost may be down on your list, but it ought to be on the list somewhere to at least recognize as an issue, that at least warn people they face their own threats when they do this. I mean, you could kill yourself doing this, and that can be a deterrent to the average billionaire who wants to go out there and dig something up. It would be good to have, as we kept saying, some international treaty, even if we can't enforce it. Maybe the other thing is simply to start to build a health system that has more capacity to deal with things, even though they're not around right now.
All right. Well, there's a blueprint that we could follow. It doesn't necessarily look great, but we've laid it out, and that's the first step. Have a plan. That's the first step. Art Caplan, thanks very much for being with us today, and hopefully you'll stay safe and well, and we won't have to worry about any anthrax coming in our neighborhoods.
I live in Connecticut. There are no dead viruses lurking around in Connecticut. It's just a bunch of housewives trying to get to Pilates.
You have different things to worry about. And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Our lovely little podcast is available everywhere good podcasts are found. Listen on your favorite platform, and if you like what you hear, please give us a good rating.
And spread the word. Tell your friends about the Innertube, and let them know they can subscribe to the podcast on our website, musicalinnertube.com.
There you can listen to all of our podcasts, see pictures and biographies of our guests, and contact us. You can even click on the microphone button in the lower right corner to leave us a voicemail.
And don't forget to leave your email address on our Talk to the Tube page so we can stay in touch.
And you can email us directly at musicalinnertube@gmail.com.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.